Cinnamon World, I'm your shorter than average girl from down under, and today we're doing something different. So this is a story channel, and what story is more important than our own? The lessons that we can learn from the world of fiction come from and can equally be learned from the real world. So today, in light of all the attention that the Middle East is receiving, we're going to tell its story. This is not a political video. Although my allegiances are very obvious, I take my job as a storyteller very seriously. So the story of the Middle East needs to be told by all the angles of those who wrote it. Not just one, by the victors and the losers, the residents and the settlers. So not just from the side of the Arabs, but all the parties involved, including the Jews and the Zionists living there. Today we'll be looking at the motives and the aims of all the parties involved and the state of the world before and during the initiation of the modern Middle East, which has led to the tumultuous state of the region. I vow to exclude any dogmatic or politically charged material and just present the history so that at the end it's up to you to make your own opinions on the matter. My only job is to be the storyteller. So let's talk stories. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was only proclaimed by the UN in Paris on the 10th of December 1948, meaning that before then, in different places, on different lands, not every man, woman, or child was equal. Of course, teachings throughout the ages promoted love for your fellow human, and if we looked at humanity on an individual scale, we would find some of those who did practice equality. But at the end of the day, human nature was human nature. Conquering and colonization was free game, the human equivalent of Darwin's evolution and the survival of the fittest. The strongest, most savage, and smartest took all, regardless of race, religion, or culture. If they could have power, they would. At the turn of the 20th century, the greatest and largest empire in the world was that of Great Britain. No thanks to the scientific advancements, industrial revolution, and wars abroad. But Britain wasn't the only growing colonial power in Europe. The increasing population in the small landmass of Europe has not only led to the spread of colonial expansion and sovereignty around the world, but the increase in political tension within the continent itself. Tensions which eventuated with the disastrous consequences in 1914. However, before we get to the First World War, we need to talk about the Jews living in Europe first. Unfortunately, being Jewish in Europe wasn't looked upon too fondly. Now, the reasons of this have been argued, with some attributing it to conflicts with the Greeks and Romans centuries ago, whilst others to the perpetuated views of medieval Christianity towards them. But to keep the integrity of the history, I won't harp too much on the theories, but the conclusion. The Jews in Europe were not treated like everyone else. They were distrusted, which made it easy for them to be used as scapegoats for rising political tension. One such case, which ultimately inspired the father of Zionism, journalist Theodor Herzl, was the Dreyfus affair, in which Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a French artillery officer of Jewish descent, was wrongly convicted of treason and sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island in French Guiana. Herzl wrote Der Judenstaat in 1896, a pamphlet originally addressed to the Rothschild Jewish banking dynasty in Europe. Der Judenstaat suggests that in order to avoid anti-Semitism, a Jewish state should be established, with multiple lands being suggested, but ultimately landing on Palestine due to its historical significance to the Jewish faith. So basically, after Moses liberated the Jews in Egypt and they were lost in the desert for 40 years, the people were allowed to relive in the land of their forefathers, the land of Canaan, home to the originator of the Abrahamic religions and his progeny, which the Jews at the time were, given that they are the descendants of Jacob's 12 sons and one daughter. However, Jerusalem itself wasn't Jewish until it was won by King David. Now, as you can see, this history isn't just significant to the Jewish faith, but to Christianity and Islam as well, given that all three of them are Abrahamic religions. As a consequence, there were many conquests for the Holy Land, and not only by the Abrahamic faiths, but those who wanted to stop them. So in itself, Palestine has a long history of war, conquering, and change in leadership. In 1897, Herzl formed the Zionist organization, now known as the World Zionist Organization, at the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. Prominent Jewish figures all around the world came together to share their vision of a Jewish state in Palestine. The Second Zionist Congress was held a year later after Herzl sent Leo Motzikin, and I'm really sorry for butchering that name, to Palestine to survey the growing Jewish population there and the original inhabitants of the land, Palestinians, under the Ottoman rule. As to not cause conflict in the area, it was mandatory that the Jews be given the right by an authority to create a Jewish state. But negotiations with the Ottomans failed, so the fate of the Jewish dream rested on the outcomes of the First World War. Turning our eyes to the Arab world now, they were no strangers to being ruled by others. They were conquered by Mongols, Persians, and Turks alike. But there were two things holding Arabs far and wide together: language and religion. Despite the atrocities committed by their rulers against them, the day-to-day affairs of the people were settled among themselves, tribal style. And so local communities were kept stable by these standards. The rulers knew if they didn't mess with these two things, the empire itself would remain relatively stable, or they would be kicked out. The final empire to rule the Arab world was the Ottoman Empire, an empire that stood for over 600 years. It was a force to be reckoned with, and as the Ottomans dared to teeter into Europe, it too threatened the political tensions in the region. Not only that, the region itself would prove valuable to the old imperial world, with the treasure trove of resources unused by the land's inhabitants and control over the Europeans' access to India, the Suez Canal. The European superpowers of Britain and France found themselves going head-to-head with the Ottoman Empire. Regardless of the reason each nation joined the war, victory would give their country a huge political advantage. Having failed to negotiate with the Ottomans, the war offered the Jews a new opportunity in forming a Jewish state in Palestine. If the Allied powers won, the land would be theirs to give to them. So, amidst the war efforts, Jewish communities wrote to their officials to support the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine, and they got what they wished. On the 2nd of November 1917, British PM Arthur Balfour signed a secret Balfour Declaration giving permission for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. This was then made public a week later. But history buffs out there may be wondering, how's that even possible? The war hasn't even ended yet. Well, in 1916, a secret treaty was formed between the British and the French with assent from Russia and Italy, called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This agreement discussed the splitting of the Ottoman Empire into smaller sovereign states for the British and the French empires, because keeping such a large country together would be dangerous for Europe in the long run. France was to take southeast Turkey, Kurdistan, Syria, and Lebanon, whilst Britain took Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. So when the fate of the Ottoman Empire seemed certain, the British Empire, whom were to take the land of Palestine, promised it to the Jews. But when it came to it, splitting the Ottoman Empire into smaller arbitrary countries wasn't easy. They were met with resistance and civil wars all over. So, in the aftermath of World War I, Britain and France were plunged into further military escapades in the Middle East, each choosing different tactics in dealing with Arab resistance to their new rulers. As for the Jewish immigrants to Palestine, well, they resolved into gang warfare against the Arab uprising to the colonial mandates in the area. To the Arabs, the current Jewish immigration was considered part of colonial rule, given that the whole Balfour Declaration exists to prove it. With the Allied powers' attention in the East, the European remnants of the Central Powers plunged the world into a Second World War. The ending of the Second World War was catastrophic, and it was because of what was seen during it and a retrospective look on the past that the United Nations were formed on the 24th of October 1945. The era of military colonization had ended, so colonial states were now granted independence. French and British mandates over the Middle East and Northern Africa were coming to an end after years of brutal bloodshed. But leaving doesn't really solve anything, particularly in Palestine. Because remember, before Sykes-Picot, these countries never existed. So they kind of have nothing to return to go by in the future, and letting them reunite to form one large country was out of the question as well, because a landmass of that size with no current government would just mean absolute chaos. The solution? The colonial powers would establish governments for each of these new countries and select a royal family from each, which will uphold their standards of governance in the area, making the countries allies of both Britain and France, unlike their predecessors, the Ottoman Empire. For some countries in the Middle East, which weren't looked on too favorably by the Ottoman Empire, this was a favorable agreement because it gave them power now. But for others, this agreement was very disadvantageous. As for Palestine, the UN had an emergency assembly in 1947 to discuss its fate. And in UN Resolution 181, they decide to split Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state, giving the Jews 57% of the land and the Arabs 43%, with Jerusalem being independent of both, governed by an international regime. This was signed off by both the Soviet Union and the United States, as well as being agreed upon by the Jews, whose percentage of land ownership would be increased by 50.5%. The Arabs did not agree, and so this resulted in the Nakba and started the Palestinian War between the Arabs and the Jews. Initially, the war consisted of Jewish gangs claiming lands offered by Resolution 181, with the British mandate withdrawing from the scene altogether. As soon as the British mandate left the region, the State of Israel was recognized as an independent country by the US and the USSR, which at this point in time weren't exactly major superpowers because the Cold War hasn't happened yet, and so the Arab League did not recognize Israel. With an influx of Arab immigrants from Palestine due to the Nakba to neighboring countries, the Arab League threatened to intervene. In preparation for this, Israel conducted Plan Dalet, which started the first of 4 Arab-Israel wars. Through foreign aid and biological warfare, Israel won the war, claiming 76% of the land of Palestine rather than the UN's resolve of 33%. The second and the third Arab-Israeli wars were initiated by Israel after Egypt's 1952 revolution, which overthrew the British-elected royal family in place of a military regime. A regime which wasn't allied to the Western world. Increased fear of a powerful non-allied nation next door, and with the nationalization of the Suez Canal by this new regime, Israel attacked and lost to the new Egyptian government, with the UN placing an emergency force in Sinai to prevent further escalation. Upon the UNEF's process of departure from the area, Israel launched a preemptive airstrike on Egypt and started the Third Arab-Israel War, commonly known as the Six-Day War. In addition to the ground offensive in Gaza and Sinai, Israel also entered the West Bank, which was part of Jordan, and Jordan, which was part of Syria, leading to Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and to some extent Lebanon to join the war as well. Upon this escalation, the US, Britain, and France entered the war and demanded a ceasefire, ending with Israel acquiring all the territories that it had entered. This, of course, led to increased tensions, particularly between Egypt and Israel. Egypt launched Operation Badr on the 6th of October 1973 and started the Fourth Arab-Israel War. Syria decided to take its chance to reclaim its taken territories too. And unfortunately for all the members in this war, which is also known as the Yom Kippur War, this was 1973, in the midst of the Cold War. Deciding that this was a good way to display their respective powers, the US backed and got involved in the war with Israel, whilst the USSR sent weaponry to Syria. Other nations decided it was also a good idea to get involved on the action, and so the UN issued Resolution 339 and renewed a call to a ceasefire to all parties. Having taken back Sinai, Egypt recognized Israel as an independent state, being the first Arab nation to do so. But that didn't mean that the people of Palestine and the newly acquired Gaza, West Bank, and Jordan were gonna accept their fate. Ever since the Third War of '67, the Palestinian resistance groups, now increased due to the added occupied territories, fought the Israelis and tried to free their land. Whenever these groups were tracked down by Israel, they would go and hide in Lebanon, which at this point was in a huge civil war. In attempts to stamp out the Palestinian resistance in Lebanon, the Israeli army invaded Lebanon twice, one in 1978 and again in 1982. The first was ended in 1981 through the US's intervention, whilst the other was won by a non-government Lebanese resistance group in the year 2000. Back in Palestine, the first Intifada occurred in 1987, also known as the Intifada of the Stones, where Palestinians across the country resisted against their homes being taken by throwing stones at the IDF. This all ended with the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993, which is also known as the two-state solution. However, this was given a 5-year interim. And so there was a misinterpretation as to what will happen after those 5 years. Consequently, no peace was achieved during those 5 years or afterwards. Preparing for the end of the 5-year period, Planned Musical Charms was underway from 1996, with the IDF carrying out Operation Field of Thorns in April of 2000. The Palestinians started the second, more violent Intifada in the September of that year, and this resistance lasted until 2005. Now, this part of the history may sound super vague, and that's because both sides tell completely different accounts, especially of what happened after the Oslo Accords of '93. As for Lebanon, ever since the invasion of '82, the resistance continued military operations to retake southern Lebanon, which the Israelis had kept after the conflict. In 2006, the White House greenlighted an attack on Lebanon by Israel to stop this, but the war ended after a month, with the Lebanese resistance coming out the victor, resulting in fears of more resistance and non-allies to the West to grow in its wake. And this brings us to modern day, where resistance groups continue to try returning the lands that were once their forefathers, and Israel is attempting to build and maintain an independent Jewish state, the one dreamt by Herzl more than a century ago. Now, as humans, we can all sympathize with the causes of each, because in essence, they are both the same, seeking security. After years of pain and prosecution, each took the opportunity in front of them to establish a symbolism of inner peace. The conflict that we currently see in the Middle East, not just in Palestine, is a consequence of an inadequate shift between colonial rule and a secular democratic regime, a consequence of dividing up a people, changing their way of life, and imposing new hierarchical systems upon them. This would and has obviously led to unrest, as well as protest and conflict. It would distract each group with their own problems, weaken them, and moving them down from first world to third world countries in a matter of decades. But of course, the Palestine issue has an added difficulty to it: the plight of the Jews. They too have suffered in the past, leading them to want an isolated country of their own. But unfortunately, the plan to ease suffering hasn't yet come to pass, with thousands dying over the wall. The words of Theodor Herzl have not come true. Unfortunately for those living so far away, they only get glimpses of what's happening in the Middle East when the veil of unreported events gets lifted, or the spell of comfort and content is broken. But for those living in the state of discomfort or discontent each day, those living unveiled to the horrors around them, they would be hardened by those horrors. They would be sick of waiting for change, and so they will resist. This isn't only true for the Jews or the Arabs, but all oppressed peoples around the world. It's human nature that we would all rather die for a cause that we believe in and in dignity than to live a horrifying, degrading, and meaningless existence. But at the end, it's left up to each person to decide what to do. It's each person's own moral code, strength, and weaknesses which drive their actions. And so we are seeing a multitude of responses, everything from the morally good, the morally bad, and everything in between. And now we're up to the part of the story where we turn from the readers to the writers. Everything I said before about human actions applies to us. Politics is not a game that everybody is good at or even likes. So there's no need for us to get political about things here. That may disappoint some of you here, but I don't believe that adding my unaccredited, unvaluable voice to the echo chamber is going to do anything. There are so many people who are speaking elements of my opinion here and there, and so at the end of the day, my opinion exists outside of my mind. And so I'm not going to reiterate it. Instead, I believe that actions speak louder than words. And so using my abilities, like doing a little bit of research, I thought that this video would be a more beneficial contribution on my behalf, giving everybody the opportunity to understand where everything came from. So I hope you learned something. The long-term solution of the current conflict is complex. I don't deny that. And I really don't think anyone that's listened to the history would deny that either, because it all started and was predicated on a world that no longer exists. And we rightfully got rid of that world. But the aftermath is that this final colony is ugly. Ugly! And the world really needs to do something to stop this ugliness. But please not with the rumbling.